They had never witnessed anything like it. A female mountain grizzly, one of the fiercest creatures in the wild frontier of North Arvora, was being crushed by a terror no one could have imagined. It wasn't a rival predator. It wasn't a human trap. It was a monstrous serpent, foreign to this land, wrapped around her like a living nightmare. A reticulated python, nearly 20 feet long and thick as a fence post, had coiled around her torso with lethal force, squeezing the breath from her lungs inch by inch. In this remote stretch of Pineback National Preserve, such a creature didn't belong. And yet, there it was, an apex predator meeting another in the most unnatural of confrontations. The forest, normally a haven for balance and rhythm, had fractured under the weight of this encounter. Something ancient and wrong pulsed in the air, as if the laws of this wild place had been snapped in two. The python's presence was an echo of a human mistake, a breach of borders that should never have been crossed. Perhaps it had been an escaped exotic pet, released into the wrong wilderness. Perhaps it had slithered free from a traveling exhibit, left to its own devices when the humans moved on. Whatever the origin, it was never meant to be here. Ranger Kalen Dorn had been on patrol since before sunrise, expecting a quiet morning. The river was thawing, birds had returned, and the forest was waking from winter's grip. He was nursing lukewarm coffee in his battered thermos when a call came through his radio, static-laced and terse. Movement spotted near Hollow Bend Ridge, possible large animal in distress. Could be a moose. Or, bigger. The call wasn't unusual. Late spring always brought complications. Tangled antlers, lingering frostbite, even occasional predator conflict. But Kalen felt something different in the operator's voice, a tremble he couldn't place. Within minutes, Kalen's forest green truck skidded to a stop on a narrow stretch of road carved through the pines. What he saw drained the warmth from his chest. There, splayed across the cracked asphalt, was a young female grizzly. But she wasn't just lying there, she was being crushed, limbs twitching under the merciless constriction of the python. Her eyes, once bright, were dulling with pain and panic. The breath caught in Kalen's throat. He had seen injured bears before, snare wounds, gunshot lacerations, vehicle strikes, but never this. Never something that looked like it had been conjured from a nightmare. His instincts screamed to act, but for one long second, he was frozen in place, unable to comprehend how two such vastly different predators had collided here, in the heart of a preserve that had never seen either submit to another. Kalen dropped the thermos, grabbed the long wooden staff from the truck bed, and radioed in, urgency cracking his voice, immediate backup at Hollow Bend. Large constrictor on native wildlife. Bear under attack. Repeat, python is killing a grizzly. Even as he stepped forward, training taking over, fear curled around the edges of his mind. He wasn't trained for this. None of them were. This was the kind of call you read about in obscure headlines out of Florida or Indonesia, not North Arvora. The python's head twisted to acknowledge the new threat, its long tongue flickering. Its yellow eyes held a stillness that was worse than rage, cold, mechanical, as if it barely registered Kalen as anything worth noticing. Kalen froze. The bear's eyes locked with his for a brief, silent moment, pleading, desperate. And in that instant, something passed between man and beast, an unspoken request for help, as primal and raw as the blood seeping into the cracks of the pavement. Then, the forest behind him split with a roar like thunder. It was not the cry of fear, nor even of anger, it was war. Kalen spun just in time to see a massive male grizzly surge through the underbrush, a blur of muscle and fury. There was no hesitation, no pause to assess. The bear charged directly at the python, unleashing a savage growl that echoed like a war cry through the trees. There are moments in life when instinct trumps understanding, when the world turns on a hinge of action, not thought. This was one of them. Kalen braced himself, certain he was in danger, but the bear wasn't coming for him. He was coming for her. The male crashed into the python with the full force of a locomotive. Teeth sank into the snake's midsection. Claws raked with the precision of a surgeon and the strength of a sledgehammer. The python hissed and flailed, its coils tightening in a panic, but the bear was unrelenting. There was violence, yes. But there was also precision, an eerie, terrifying intelligence behind the bear's attack. He knew where to strike, how to tear. He didn't fight like a beast defending territory. He fought like something possessed, like a soldier who knew that one misstep meant death for someone he could not bear to lose. He fought not with the dispassionate instinct of a predator, but with a rage and urgency that felt startlingly personal. Within moments, Kalen's reinforcements arrived, 3 more rangers, drawn by his call. One of them fired a warning shot into the air to scare the snake, another jabbed a pole toward its tail. The serpent, overwhelmed, began to loosen its grip. Sometimes, it takes more than strength to save a life. It takes timing, noise, distraction, the tiniest of windows. With a final wheezing grunt, the female collapsed to the ground, free at last. Her flanks heaved as she fought to breathe, her chest rising and falling like waves in a storm. It was over. But the male wasn't done. Bloodied and snarling, he stood over her like a living wall. The snake, sensing defeat, slithered off into the underbrush, leaving a trail of red in the dust. Yet the male bear didn't pursue it. He didn't flee. He didn't even flinch. He stayed. And that, in its own way, was more shocking than the fight itself. He stood guard over her broken body, breathing heavy, dark eyes never leaving her form. There was no fear in him, no need for dominance. Only presence. Only stillness. The kind that can only be born from bonds unseen. It was the kind of moment you'd expect from a human lover at a hospital bedside, not from a wild animal on a blood-soaked forest road. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause. The air thickened with reverence. One ranger muttered something under his breath, something about instincts, about how bears don't do this. Not really. But Kalen knew better. He saw something in the male's eyes that defied science. Finally, Kalen whispered to the others, "He saved her life." But it was more than that. It was the way he stayed, the way his body curved around hers, not as a protector on patrol, but as something older, deeper. This wasn't survival. This was something else. Something almost human. And perhaps, in a forest ruled by instinct, it was that flicker of something more, something unexplainable, that made it all the more wild. The injured female lay motionless on the sun-baked asphalt. Her breath came in shallow, painful pulls. Dust clung to her blood-matted fur, and the deep bruises beneath her ribs, angry shades of blue and violet, told the tale of how close death had truly come. Ranger Kalen Dorn crouched beside her, careful and slow, his hand trembling just slightly. Around him, the other rangers moved with hushed urgency. They spoke in whispers, not because of fear, but because something sacred was happening, and they knew it. All eyes were drawn to the male Grizzly, massive, breathless, covered in blood that wasn't his own. He hovered over the female, his dark gaze sharp and deliberate, not aggressive, not wild, but protective, calculating, daring anyone to take one step too close. There's a stillness in nature that doesn't ask for permission, it demands it, the kind of silence that feels heavier than thunder. This was that kind of moment. The air around them vibrated with more than sound. It carried the weight of instinct pressed against understanding, of something unspoken trying desperately to be heard. And it came from him, from the one creature none of them dared to challenge. Ranger Daria Holt, the team's field medic, murmured, "We've got to help her." Kalen nodded, watching the male pace a tight arc around the fallen bear. "We just need to do it without getting torn apart," he replied grimly. The male let out a low, guttural sound, like a growl softened by grief. Then, something happened no one expected. The female bear whimpered. It was faint, barely audible, but the male stopped. He stepped back. 2 steps. No more. Just enough to let them try. As if he was saying, "You may help, but I'm watching." Kalen raised one hand, open and slow. "Easy, girl," he said softly, his voice the same he'd used once with a dying elk in a winter storm. "We're going to help." The rangers moved as one. Gloves. Towels. A stretcher brought up from the truck. Daria gently injected a mild sedative into the bear's haunch, just enough to calm her. The male huffed, clearly aware of every motion, but he didn't move forward. As they wrapped her battered midsection, the full damage became clear: deep abrasions from the asphalt, puncture wounds along her flank from the python's teeth, ribs visibly bruised, likely cracked. But she was breathing, still fighting. "She's going to make it," Daria whispered under her breath, tightening the final strap on the stretcher. Together, they hoisted her into the open ranger vehicle. That's when the male bear moved. He exhaled, a sound like sorrow made real. Then, he followed, step by step, heavy, deliberate. When the Rangers reached the truck's tailgate, he stood on his hind legs and placed both paws on the edge, as if trying to board. One Ranger blinked in disbelief. Is he trying to come with her? Kalen swallowed. I think he is. The decision was made in seconds, though it would echo for the rest of their lives. They didn't dare leave him behind, not after what he'd done, not with what they'd seen. Give them the supply flatbed, Kalen said. He can stay with her. He's earned that much. They gently shifted the stretcher onto the open flatbed of a larger transport truck, layering padding to cushion her. The male climbed in after her, no hesitation, no aggression, just a quiet determination. He curled around her, like a wall of muscle and fur, not touching the wounds, not smothering, just near enough. What does a bear understand of grief? Of hope? Of love? It's easy for us to assume that only humans carry such burdens. But moments like this make you question that assumption. This wasn't dominance. It wasn't instinct for territory or reproduction. This was something else. Something that made even the most seasoned rangers feel humbled. As the truck rolled forward through the winding forest road, no one spoke. Every bump and jolt felt like it might crack the fragile thread tying this story together. And all the while, the male bear, still unnamed, still wild, watched over her. Never looking away. Never moving, he stayed like a soldier on watch. By the time they reached the gates of the Arvora Wildlife Rescue Outpost, the bond between the bears had already become legend among the team. But what came next would turn that legend into something deeper, something unforgettable. The outpost had seen its share of suffering, birds with shattered wings, wolves caught in snares, even lynx brought in after illegal traps tore muscle from bone. But never this. 2 adult grizzlies. One injured, one refusing to leave. Dr. Evangeline Moreth, the center's lead vet, met them at the main barn doors, clipboard in hand, expecting a routine trauma case. Then she saw the massive male leap from the truck and stand guard as they lowered the female onto a rolling gurney. He followed her here, she asked, startled. Kalen nodded. He did more than that. He saved her life. Evangeline scanned the female's wounds with clinical efficiency, her mind racing. She's in critical shape. I need to get her inside. Can you hold him back? The Rangers exchanged looks. Kalen shook his head. We tried. He won't go far. But he's not leaving. They wheeled the stretcher into the treatment bay. The male padded behind them, his steps thunderous but never reckless. He stopped just outside the surgery room, eyes locked on the figure behind the glass. Inside, monitors began to beep, machines clicked to life. The female was stabilized and sedated. Her vitals held. Her ribs would heal. Her heart, beating hard and fast, still had fight in it. In the adjoining room, they prepped a containment area for the male, but when they tried to shut the door between them, a sound erupted from his chest, a bellow not of anger, but anguish. It made the youngest nurse cry. They opened the door. He walked in without hesitation. He didn't growl, didn't interfere. He lay down beside her table, resting his massive head on his paws. His eyes, wide and unblinking, never strayed from her face. How often do we witness love in silence? No rings. No vows. No ceremony. Just presence. Just being there when it matters. For this bear, there was no language, no gesture to explain his actions. He only knew she was hurt, and that he couldn't walk away. Evangeline stood at the edge of the room and whispered, he knows. He knows she's not out of danger, and he's not leaving until she is. That night, the room was silent but for the beeping of monitors and the soft wind against the windows. The male bear did not sleep. Every time her breath hitched, he lifted his head. Every time a machine beeped, he listened. At 2 a.m., Evangeline returned to check vitals. She expected snarls, panic, territorial aggression. Instead, the male watched her with calm, clear eyes. When she touched the female's paw, he lowered his head again, as if to say, you're helping. That's enough. By dawn, they gave them names. The female, Solara, for the fire in her spirit. The male, Bran, like the mountain wind, steady and strong. The names felt right, as if they'd always belonged to them. The air was cold that night, crisp and motionless beneath the trees. The moon hung low, silver and solemn, casting dappled shadows over the pine needles where Solara slept. Her chest rose and fell steadily now, a rhythm once threatened, now restored. But even in sleep, there was a tension in her limbs, a quiet guarding of something deeper, something that hadn't fully healed. And just beyond the habitat gate, Bran lingered in the trees. Not close. Not gone. The rangers watched him from a distance, through quiet monitors and thermal cameras. He moved like a ghost, present but unseen, pausing now and then to sniff the air as if trying to catch her scent through the wind. Somewhere along the way, his hunger had returned, not with urgency, but with need. That afternoon, a deer had passed through the edges of the observation field. Bran had not chased it, but he had followed, not to kill, just to remember. To remember what it felt like to be. Kaelin had watched it happen through binoculars and whispered to no one in particular, "He's remembering who he is." But that was only partly true. Bran had never forgotten who he was. What he'd nearly forgotten, what he feared losing, was the reason to be that bear again. Because to be wild meant to let go, and some part of him wasn't ready. A week earlier, he had been the embodiment of control. A creature of strength, capable of defending, of enduring. But now he was something more vulnerable, more human, in a way. He was waiting on someone else's timeline, and that is a terrifying place to live, in the pause between hope and release. Inside the habitat, Solara stirred just before dawn. She rose slowly, stiff from sleep, and walked a small, deliberate circle under the branches. She tested her weight, leaned into a tree, then sniffed the moss at its base. These were small movements, but in the quiet language of healing, they were monumental. In another life, in a different kind of story, this would have been the end. A clean return. A heroic tale closed. But life doesn't work like that. Not in the wild. Not in the heart. Healing isn't a straight path. It loops. It stalls. It steps backward before it dares step forward again. And as the sun warmed the treetops, a soft sound slipped through the air. A chuff. Low. Short. Barely audible. It came from Solara, nose lifted gently toward the gate she could no longer see from her position in the woods. Just a breath. A note of awareness. And several hundred yards away, Bran lifted his head. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't coincidence. It was connection. That afternoon, Rena, one of the junior biologists, left a note in the sender's logbook. Bran tracked closer today, circling within 100 yards of the gate. He paused at a pine Solara had rubbed against. Sat there for a while. Didn't touch it. Just sat, like he was waiting for a signal. She underlined the last sentence twice. And later that night, while the stars blinked through thin clouds and the forest hummed with wind, Kaelin sat alone in the observation hut, writing in his field journal. Every predator I've ever known moves with purpose. Territory, hunger, dominance. But Bran is something else entirely. He's not pacing out of confusion. He's not howling with grief. He's waiting. Waiting for a sign she's strong enough to forget him, just long enough to survive. In stories told around campfires and classrooms, we often reduce animals to patterns. Predator and prey. Alpha and follower. But then something like this happens, a bond forged not by instinct, but by choice, and you start to wonder if we've underestimated the depth of wild hearts. By the end of the second week, the habitat team made a quiet decision. They would leave the outer gate unlatched. Not forced open, not artificial, just possible. If Solara wished to roam, to return to the greater wilderness, she could. And if Bran was meant to find her again, he would. There would be no ceremony, no headlines, no human closure, only the slow unraveling of something sacred, something earned. That morning, Kaelin opened the gate himself. He didn't tell the others. He simply walked out with the key, turned it once, and stepped back. He didn't look for Bran on the way in. He didn't look for Solara on the way out. Some things are meant to happen unobserved. That evening, a ranger drone captured an image from far above, Solara walking through the clearing near the outer trees, alone but strong, her stride steady, head low. Bran's thermal signature appeared hours later, at a different spot, close, but not overlapping. They were tracing a circle, their own kind of orbit, neither rushing, neither lost. And that's the strange, powerful truth no textbook ever teaches. Sometimes, the fiercest devotion is the kind that waits in silence. The kind that doesn't chase, doesn't demand, but simply endures, like a stone worn smooth by the river, steady and still, no matter how fast the current rushes past it. The room went still as the sedative wore off, and Bran stirred. His breathing, ragged at first, calmed into long, uneven exhales. His eyes, those dark, intelligent wells, opened slowly and scanned the ceiling. They held no confusion, no alarm, only a dull ache. For a long time, he didn't move, not out of fear, not even pain, but something quieter. He was listening for her. Outside the surgical suite, the halls of the Wildlife Center felt more like a monastery than a clinic. Footsteps were hushed. Voices, if spoken at all, were kept low and respectful, as though the weight of what had returned through their gates was too heavy to carry with sound. Solara was not in the building. Not yet. The staff had made the careful decision to keep her temporarily at the outer enclosures, where the air was fresh and the noise distant. They feared her presence might cause Bran distress during those fragile first hours. But it wasn't distress Bran felt. It was incompleteness. His head turned slightly toward the doorway, where her scent was weakest. His paw shifted once. A small movement, but in the context of everything, it was enormous. "He knows," whispered Rena, watching from the glass. "He knows she isn't here." That night, the wind returned. It curled through the pine trees outside and crept into the seams of the old outpost, rattling the rafters and hissing beneath the doors. It was the kind of wind that carried memory, the kind that haunted and healed in equal measure. And through that wind came a sound, not loud, not frantic, just steady. Solara, from the perimeter of the sanctuary, had let out a chuff. It drifted down the corridor like smoke, unnoticed by most, but not by Bran. He stirred. His ears twitched. And though he did not rise, his entire body leaned subtly toward the direction of her voice. In that moment, even the monitors seemed to pause between beeps. Evangeline stood in the observation hallway, arms folded tight, tears unblinking in her eyes. She had seen death before, too often, in fact. She had stitched broken wings, held fading paws, and signed the final lines on too many reports. But this was something rare. Not just survival, not even devotion. This was shared memory, living memory, the kind forged through fire and fear and trust that had no name. Bran didn't need to hear her to know she was near. He could feel it. The next morning, he stood. It was not graceful. His hind legs moved stiffly. His front leg, mangled days earlier by the poacher's snare, shook as it bore weight for the first time. But he didn't collapse. He planted his paws. He stood. The staff watched, breath held, as he limped toward the edge of the room, his body swaying slightly, muscles trembling under scarred fur. Each step was a question. Can I still move? Will it still hold me? And each answer came in the form of a slow, deliberate step forward. By the time he reached the sliding door that led to the outer compound, his breathing had grown heavy. But when they opened it, and he caught the first full scent of pine and bark and fur, he let out a low huff that sounded like relief, not triumph, not challenge, just relief. Kaelin was waiting by the gate that led toward Solara's enclosure. She had been brought closer that morning, housed in a spacious half-acre pen at the tree line, a safe transitional space. She, too, was pacing, not out of worry, but of readiness. Her coat had grown thick again. Her wounds, long sealed, had faded into silvery marks beneath the fur, like old rivers that had carved through land and dried up, leaving only shapes in the rock. When she heard the gate unlatch, she paused. Bran limped forward, his gait uneven but resolute. And when their eyes met through the split in the fencing, no more than 4 feet between them, neither moved. Not right away. The staff watched from behind reinforced glass and cameras, holding radios, clipboards, and hearts so full they barely beat. Solara stepped forward first. Her paws made no sound on the soft dirt, and her body lowered just slightly, as if to make herself smaller. Not submissive, inviting. Bran leaned in. The gate opened. 1 second passed. Then another. And then, they met. No charge. No sound. Just the soft meeting of noses. The reunion wasn't grand or dramatic. It was sacred. They stood that way for nearly a minute, breathing in one another like pages of a familiar book. Bran moved first this time, circling her slowly, pausing to brush his side along hers. His limp was evident, his strength returning, but not yet whole. Solara leaned into him with the gentleness of someone who knew exactly where it hurt. Later, as the sun crested over the trees and the wind settled, the two of them curled together beneath a cedar stump. The staff didn't approach. They didn't need to. They had done their part. Now it was nature's turn to speak. And in the days that followed, the recovery quickened. Bran's appetite returned. His coat grew full. His gait, still marked by a drag, became faster. And Solara? She never left his side. Not out of dependence, but of choice. Together, they moved through the enclosure like constellations in orbit, distinct, but always drawn back to each other. And just beyond the trees, the wild waited, not just with danger, but with possibility. The days that followed were slow, quiet, and heavy with waiting. Bran's injury was brutal, deep muscle damage, shredded tendons, raw tissue exposed to infection. But he fought. Even when the pain was sharp enough to make him collapse mid-step, he gritted through it, never snarling, never retreating into fear. He wanted to heal, and everyone knew why. Solara had returned to the Wildlife Center, not because she had to, but because she chose to. They placed her in the adjacent enclosure, just beyond the medical ward. She could see him, smell him, and every morning, she waited by the fence, watching as the crate rolled Bran out for his few minutes of sun and fresh air. She never made a sound, and she never left. Bran would lift his head at the scent of her and huff, a low, tired sound. But when he stumbled or let out a pained groan, Solara would chuff softly in return. Encouragement, reassurance. You're still here. I still see you. Each time, Bran would try again, and each time, he grew a little steadier. His front paw still trembled when it bore his weight, the leg thick with swelling that would take weeks to subside. But he never let it define him. Pain, to Bran, was not a wall, it was a teacher. A test of endurance, not a punishment. And he met each lesson with quiet resolve. The staff watched from a respectful distance, as if intruding too closely might shatter the fragile magic that seemed to linger between them. There were no charts that could explain what they were witnessing. No research papers could quantify the connection, but it was real, tangible. Like gravity, it pulled them to one another. 3 weeks passed. Then, on a misty morning painted with dew and silence, he stood, on his own. No help. No crate. The limp was there, a drag in his front leg, but he was upright. He took 5 steps, then 10, his breathing heavy, but steady. Evangeline stood at the observation window, hand pressed to the glass. He won't ever run like before, she said quietly, but he's not meant to run. He's meant to endure, and he has. Solara chuffed from across the enclosure, as if answering her. To those who had watched his journey from the start, the moment carried a quiet, profound beauty. Here was a creature once brought to his knees by the cruelty of a hidden snare. Now, though he limped, he walked. And more than that, he chose to walk toward life. Toward her. Solara watched every step with eyes that seemed to glow in the morning light. When he stumbled, she didn't panic. She didn't pace. She waited, patient and steady. A lighthouse in the fog of his recovery. The staff gave them a few more days, just enough for Bran to build strength. His appetite had returned. His coat shone again. He walked slowly, but with purpose. Each time Solara approached the barrier, he moved a little closer. The limp didn't matter anymore, because she waited, and she always would. Then, the final gate opened. No words were spoken. The sun crept slowly over the tree line, golden light flooding the clearing behind the center. 2 rangers stood nearby, Kaelin and Daria. No guns. No tranquilizers. Just quiet breath and pounding hearts. Bran stepped into the clearing first. Solara followed. There were no cages. No leashes. No barriers. Just the open forest and a path only they could follow. Kaelin exhaled slowly. Take care of each other, he whispered. Bran didn't look back. Side by side, they crossed the clearing and disappeared into the trees. Not as symbols. Not as patience. As family. Weeks passed. Autumn crept into the preserve like a song in a lower key. The leaves turned gold and ember orange. The wind carried stories across the valley, of bears seen near the mountain lake, 2 figures always together. Bran, still limping, still watching. Solara, strong, leading. They never strayed far from each other. Rangers tracked their movements from time to time, soft signals from distant collars, prints in soft mud, scratches high in tree bark where only a bear with something to protect would leave its mark. Those claw marks, etched into the bark like ancient runes, told a story deeper than any satellite ping could reveal. They were a language of survival, of love, of belonging. The staff began calling them brand sentinels, natural totems left as both warning and promise. I was here. She is near. Stay away. Then, one morning, a drone sent back an image. Solara lying in a sun-drenched meadow, her body stretched across the golden grass like poetry, and not far off, watching from a shadowed tree line, stood Bran. His coat bore the faint scar where the snare had once bitten deep. His step was slow, still uneven, but his eyes, they were bright, alive, guarding, loving. It was the kind of image you didn't just see, you felt it. To the Rangers, it was a miracle captured in pixels. A photograph that said everything without needing a single caption. It was printed and pinned to the main board at the center. Over time, others would join it, footage, glimpses, traces, but none held the quiet weight of that single frame, her in light, him in shadow, both still tethered by something unseen. And while the world beyond the preserve continued, busy, indifferent, noisy, the forest kept its hush. Solara hunted fish near the riverbank, her movements fluid, commanding. Bran watched from upstream, his reflection rippling beside hers. Sometimes, they wandered apart, for hours, maybe even days. But never far, never truly alone, because once in a lifetime, maybe less, two wild souls collide in a moment that changes them both, not because they need each other to survive, but because in each other, they remember why they're alive. A year had passed. Winter had returned to Pineback National Preserve, blanketing the highlands in snow and stillness. The rivers slowed to a crawl beneath thin sheets of ice. Wind traced quiet songs through the bare branches. And deep in the folds of the valley, far from roads and ranger stations, life stirred beneath the cold. The story of the two bears, Bran and Solara, had become legend. Visitors asked about them. Rangers watched for signs. Trail cams occasionally picked up a silhouette, always at dusk or just before dawn. A lumbering figure by the river. A smaller one near the pines. Never far apart, never too close to humans. They had faded from sight, but not from memory. Like smoke rising from an ancient fire, their presence lingered in the land's breath and the hush between snowfall. Children visiting the preserve pointed to tracks in the mud and asked if they belonged to the brave bear and his mate. Rangers didn't always answer aloud, but their eyes said enough. In early spring, fresh tracks appeared outside the eastern ridge. Large prints, heavier on one side, slightly dragging Bran, and smaller ones, weaving beside them, Solara. But this time, there was something else. Tiny prints. Unsteady, wandering, 3 of them. Ranger Kalen found them first. He knelt beside the frozen trail, pressing his glove to the impressions left in the thawing earth. His heart thudded in his chest. He didn't need confirmation. Bran had survived. Solara had thrived. And now, new life walked beside them. There was a time when no one believed a male bear could nurture, protect, or even stay. But Bran had rewritten those expectations, not in words, but in silent witness. In patience. In presence. And now, in the imprints of his cub's first clumsy steps. They were never seen up close, not together, not all 5, but the signs were there, claw marks on a cedar stump, tufts of fur on a low-hanging branch, paw prints circling a hollow tree where cubs might have been sheltered from the wind. Once, a trail cam captured a fleeting moment, Bran walking at dawn, his gait still uneven but purposeful. A cub darted across the frame, then another. Solara followed in the background, head high, fur glowing gold in the morning light. That image, blurry, half obscured by brush, became the preserve's most treasured photo. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't centered, but it was everything. Sometimes, late at night, the rangers at the preserve would sit quietly near the fire pit outside the main station, listening to the wind as it moved through the trees. And sometimes, if the wind shifted just right, they swore they heard it. A low, warm chuff. A second, smaller one in reply. And once, just once, the sound of 3 curious little growls tumbling after them. They say wilderness is indifferent, that nature survives by survival alone. But anyone who stood in that clearing, who saw the way Bran curled his broken body around Solara in the back of that truck, they knew better. Bran had kept his promise. Solara had carried the future forward. Together, they had built something that few ever believed possible in the wild. Not dominance, not instinct, but family. And the forest remembered. Spring melted the frost from the ridge trails. Moss bloomed where snow had clung too long. Wildflowers dared to peek from stone cracks. And somewhere, tucked beneath a nest of pine and cedar, 3 bear cubs found joy in play, biting tails, climbing low limbs, discovering the simple miracle of balance. Bran watched them all. Never overbearing, never loud, just near. And Solara led. She taught them how to dig through rot for grubs, how to test ice before stepping onto a stream, how to wait before charging, how to chuff, not growl, when unsure. Lessons passed not just in survival, but in legacy. There were stories like this before, whispered among conservationists and old trackers, of male bears who'd linger after mating, of pairs who crossed paths more than once. But never like this. Never this long, never this deep. Somewhere in a dusty academic journal, a behavioral ecologist might argue it was coincidence, or overlapping territory, or trauma bonding, and perhaps there was truth in that. But truth, in the wild, has many faces. Ask anyone who watched Bran nearly die twice, only to rise, again and again, for something beyond instinct, something he could never name, something he simply chose. Again, and again. Sometimes the strongest stories aren't the ones written down, they're the ones left behind in tracks across the snow. They're the soft indentations by a riverbed, the long scratch on a tree, the echo of a chuff in the mist, and the quiet return of spring in a place that once knew silence too well. So if you ever find yourself walking through Pineback Preserve, and you see a crooked paw print near a patch of yellow violets, or hear a rustle deeper than the wind's whisper, maybe pause, listen, and remember that love, even in its wildest form, can leave marks that last forever. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of loyalty, courage, and the quiet, wild love that lives far beyond our reach, but never beyond our understanding. Like, share, and tell someone who still believes in the power of silent promises.